The night was heavy with silence, and inside the grand palatial apartment perched high above downtown Chicago, a hidden storm brewed beneath the gleaming surface. Tonight, the millionaire had come home early, unannounced, unexpected, and what he found left him utterly speechless. But before we get to that moment, I want you to pause for a second and imagine how it feels to pour your heart into something day after day, only to be overlooked and invisible in the very place your love makes a home. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cooking dinner for someone who never says thank you, or washing dishes while everyone else sleeps. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will move you. Her name was Rosa Ramirez, a woman with deep roots and gentle hands, the humble cook who held together the house from the inside. In this expansive, sterile Chicago penthouse overlooking the shimmering skyline, she was the silent pulse of warmth, the pulse no one acknowledged until it stopped. At 4:30 in the morning, while the city still slept beneath a blanket of Lake Michigan fog, Rosa's weathered fingers already moved with practiced grace through her domain. The kitchen was her cathedral, and she its devoted priestess. The marble countertops gleamed under soft pendant lights, reflecting surfaces that cost more than most people's annual income. Every appliance was top of the line. A 6-burner Wolf range that could feed a small restaurant, a sub-zero refrigerator larger than many studio apartments, and copper pots that gleamed like burnished gold. But Rosa knew that no amount of money could buy what she brought to this space: soul. She was a self-taught culinary artist, descended from a family that treasured food as a language of love passed down through generations of Mexican cooks. Her grandmother's voice still whispered through her movements as she ground fresh masa between her palms, each tortilla a prayer shaped by hands that carried decades of tradition. The scent of slow-cooked mole began to waft through the closed doors, its complex layers of chocolate and chilies mingling with the promise of comfort that only comes from hours of patient stirring. In the distance, she could hear the faint hum of the Lakeshore Drive traffic beginning its morning dance, but here in her kitchen, time moved differently. Rosa folded napkins with the same care she gave to kneading dough, each crease precise, each corner sharp. Her employers might not notice these details, but Rosa knew that love lived in the smallest gestures. Charles Kensington owned this fortress of glass and steel, 30 floors above the bustling streets of the magnificent Mile. His net worth exceeded 8 figures, built through shrewd real estate investments and a portfolio of properties that stretched from Chicago's Gold Coast to Miami's exclusive Fisher Island. His wealth was diversified: stocks, bonds, cryptocurrency holdings that included substantial Bitcoin investments and enough liquid assets to buy entire city blocks. Yet for all his financial success, Charles was a man crowned in wealth but starved for warmth. The penthouse felt more like a museum than a home, its pristine surfaces reflecting emptiness rather than life. Rosa had arrived 6 years ago, a young woman escaping hardship in the Pilsen neighborhood with nothing but a suitcase and an unmatched gift for turning the humblest ingredients into dishes that felt like home. She remembered that first interview, standing in Charles's gleaming office while he barely looked up from his laptop, discussing her salary as if she were another commodity to be acquired. The numbers meant survival to her, but to him they were pocket change, less than what he spent on a single bottle of wine for his dinner parties. She took the job with pride, believing that even here, in this glass box of privilege, her food could build bridges no words ever could. Every morning, she transformed the sterile kitchen into something alive. The tortilla press sang its familiar rhythm against the marble, each press releasing steam that carried the essence of corn and lime. Her molcajete, inherited from her abuela, ground spices that had traveled generations, creating pastes and salsas that no food processor could replicate. The industrial dishwasher might clean the plates, but Rosa washed her clay pots by hand, whispering gratitudes as warm water blessed each vessel that had held her love. The children of the household, 16-year-old Madison and 14-year-old Tyler, often ignored her meals, choosing DoorDash orders or leaving their plates barely touched. Madison would wrinkle her nose at Rosa's homemade pozole, preferring overpriced salads from trendy Lincoln Park cafes. Tyler lived on energy drinks and protein bars, dismissing Rosa's carefully prepared breakfast burritos as too ethnic for his refined teenage palate. In the mornings, Rosa would find their untouched plates, the food growing cold like her hopes of connecting with these children who had everything except appreciation. Charles himself treated Rosa as a replaceable fixture, another expense in his monthly household budget alongside the landscaping service and cleaning crew. "Anyone can boil rice," he once flippantly remarked during a phone conversation with his attorney, unaware that Rosa was within earshot, arranging fresh flowers she had bought with her own meager wages to brighten the dining room. The sentence seared her pride, but never broke her resolve. She understood that to him, her skills were as common as the cleaning supplies locked away in the utility closet, her years of knowledge reducible to basic tasks any minimum wage worker could perform. The glamorous guests at Charles's opulent dinner parties praised the cuisine blandly, but never asked for the cook's name. They would swirl expensive wines, vintages worth more than Rosa earned in 6 months, and debate the subtle notes of oak and vanilla while completely ignoring the woman whose careful seasoning made their lamb taste like something more than expensive protein. Rosa would watch from the kitchen doorway as they photographed their plates for social media, her artistry reduced to background content for their curated lives of luxury. Every day was a battlefield of small humiliations disguised as casual disregard. Charles would change his dinner requests 3 times, expecting Rosa to accommodate each whim without considering the hours of preparation already invested. When business associates visited, he would introduce the wine collection, the imported cheeses, the organic vegetables flown in from California farms. But Rosa remained invisible, the hands that transformed these expensive ingredients into nourishment as anonymous as the delivery drivers who brought them to the door. Her uniform became her costume for this daily performance of servitude, her name badge reading simply kitchen staff, because Charles had never bothered to learn how to pronounce Ramirez correctly. During the long winter months when Lake Michigan's winds rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows, Rosa would arrive before dawn, her breath visible in the morning air as she walked from the L station to the towering residence. The doorman knew her by sight, but not by name, nodding politely as she took the service elevator to the kitchen. Her world was one of invisible threads connecting the family's comfort to her quiet devotion, her exhausted hands folding countless napkins, stirring sauces and memories alike. She took pride in every tortilla made by hand, every careful sprinkle of cinnamon over homemade horchata, though her employers barely spared her a glance or a word of thanks. When the new sous chef arrived, a young, flashy culinary graduate fresh from the Culinary Institute of America, Rosa felt the ground shift beneath her feet like the Chicago winter ice she navigated each morning. The brass nameplate on the kitchen door suddenly read, "Executive Kitchen," and Rosa found herself relegated to prep work that felt more like punishment than partnership. Xavier Montclair was 26 years old, armed with a degree that cost more than Rosa's annual salary, and an ego inflated by Instagram followers who appreciated his molecular gastronomy experiments. He arrived with a collection of equipment that looked more suited to a chemistry lab than a kitchen: liquid nitrogen tanks, centrifuge machines, and precision scales that measured ingredients to the fraction of a gram. Charles was immediately impressed by this young man who spoke the language of modernist cuisine, throwing around terms like spherification and foam reduction with the confidence of someone selling investment opportunities. Xavier's plating looked like abstract art, each dish photographed extensively before being served. But Rosa noticed what the others missed. The guests often left these artistic creations half-eaten, their beauty not translating to satisfaction. The children complained that the food tasted weird, and even Charles himself would quietly raid the refrigerator later in the evening, searching for something that felt like actual nourishment rather than performance. Rosa was given menial tasks, peeling potatoes, fetching forgotten ingredients from the storage room, cleaning Xavier's elaborate equipment after his experiments. The young chef treated her like an obstacle to his vision, speaking to her only in curt commands and dismissive gestures. He rearranged her carefully organized spice collection, labeling everything with his own system that made no sense to someone who identified seasonings by scent and intuition rather than printed tags. Her decades of lived taste were deemed obsolete by molecular foams and plating theatrics that prioritized appearance over sustenance. Yet, Rosa never faltered. She continued her secret work in the shadows, adding a pinch of salt here, a dash of warmth there. When Xavier's deconstructed chicken mole threatened to collapse into pretentious nonsense, Rosa quietly adjusted the base sauce with traditional techniques that her grandmother's hands had taught her. When the spherical tortilla essence confused and disappointed the dinner guests, Rosa's emergency batch of fresh, warm tortillas saved the evening. Her dignity came from a quiet, steadfast belief that true cooking needed no fanfare, no Instagram posts, no molecular manipulation, just love, patience, and respect for ingredients that had nourished humanity for generations. A lucky star crossed her path when little Emma Kensington, the youngest of the family at 8 years old, sought refuge from parental neglect in Rosa's kitchen. Emma was different from her older siblings, curious rather than dismissive, lonely rather than entitled. While Madison and Tyler were absorbed in their devices and social climbing, Emma gravitated toward the warm sounds and rich aromas that filled Rosa's workspace. She would sit on a small stool beside the stove, watching Rosa's hands move with the grace of a conductor leading an orchestra of flavors. "Why does your food smell like hugs?" Emma asked one afternoon, her small voice cutting through the kitchen's ambient noise like a bell. Rosa paused in her stirring, looking down at this child who seemed to understand something that the adults in her life had forgotten. "Because that's what food is supposed to do, Misha," Rosa replied softly, the Spanish endearment slipping out naturally. "It's supposed to make you feel loved." These simple conversations blossomed into daily rituals. Emma would race home from her expensive private school, seeking the comfort of Rosa's kitchen over the cold precision of her family's scheduled activities. Rosa taught Emma that real food isn't measured by ingredients, but by intention. She showed the little girl how to test maza by pressing it between her fingers, how to know when onions were ready not by the timer but by the sound they made in the pan, how to fold empanadas so that the love stayed sealed inside. Emma's eyes would widen as Rosa shared stories from her childhood in Mexico, tales of markets where vendors sang out their offerings and grandmothers passed down recipes through touch rather than written words. These moments filled the sterile penthouse with something it had never known: the sound of genuine laughter, the sight of 4 hands working together, the warmth of knowledge passed from one generation to another. In those precious hours, Rosa's kitchen became a sanctuary filled with giggles and whispered secrets, the only place in the house that felt truly alive. Emma would carefully arrange flowers in small vases, mimicking Rosa's daily ritual of bringing natural beauty into the manufactured perfection of their home. Together, they would make simple cookies, Emma's small hands struggling with the rolling pin while Rosa guided her with patient encouragement. The child began to understand that cooking was a form of love made visible, and Rosa began to remember why she had fallen in love with feeding people in the first place. Charles would sometimes find his daughter in the kitchen, flour in her hair and contentment on her face, but he dismissed these scenes as harmless play rather than recognizing the profound connection being forged. To him, Emma's happiness was just another household detail, like the fresh flowers or perfectly folded linens that he took for granted. He never stopped to consider that his youngest child was learning lessons about love and care that no amount of money could purchase, wisdom that would shape her understanding of home for the rest of her life. Then came the big event, the annual charity gala hosted by Charles, a night meant to impress his high society friends and demonstrate the sophistication that separated old money from new. The guest list read, like a who's who of Chicago's elite, real estate magnates, tech entrepreneurs, political figures, and society wives whose charity work was more about networking than actual service. This year's cause was childhood hunger, an irony that wasn't lost on Rosa as she watched Charles spend more on flowers than most families earned in a month, all to discuss helping hungry children while never noticing the emotional starvation in his own home. Charles had hired a famous celebrity chef for the occasion, a man known for his glamorous cooking shows and ruthless ambition. Chef Marco Santini arrived with his own crew, immediately claiming the kitchen as his temporary kingdom and dismissing Rosa as an obstacle to his grand vision. His reputation was built on spectacle rather than sustenance, dishes that looked stunning under television lights but often left diners unsatisfied. Marco had appeared on cooking shows, authored best-selling cookbooks, and commanded fees that exceeded Rosa's annual salary for a single evening's work. The celebrity chef immediately dismissed Rosa as an impediment to his artistic process, barricading her out of the main kitchen except during cleanup duty. His crew moved through her carefully organized space like invaders, rearranging equipment, discarding her prepared stocks, and treating her domain as if it were empty real estate waiting for their superior presence. Marco spoke to Rosa only in curt commands, his voice dripping with condescension as he assigned her tasks that felt designed more to humiliate than to utilize her skills. Rosa watched the show from the sidelines, her heart pounding beneath a fragile calm as she observed the celebrity chef's assistants struggling with basic techniques that she could perform in her sleep. The expensive ingredients, imported truffles, organic vegetables, premium meats, were being transformed into dishes that prioritized appearance over nourishment. She noticed the subtle mistakes, the over-seasoned sauces, the proteins that would be overcooked by the time they reached the dining room. Her trained palate detected the absence of love in every dish, the mechanical precision that produced food as costume rather than comfort. Unable to watch the evening collapse into synthetic emptiness, Rosa began making small adjustments under the radar. When Marco's assistant oversalted the soup, Rosa quietly prepared fresh stock to dilute the mistake. When the main course sauce lacked depth, she added touches of her own mole base, transforming pretentious molecular gastronomy into something that actually tasted like food. Her humble interventions kept the meal from becoming a complete disaster, though she received no credit for salvaging the celebrity chef's reputation. The guests wandered through the penthouse, champagne glasses catching the light from crystal chandeliers, their conversations mixing charity pledges with investment strategies. Women wore jewelry worth more than Rosa's neighborhood homes while discussing the plight of hungry children, their concern as performative as the food they were consuming. Charles moved through the crowd like a gracious host, accepting compliments on his chef's innovative menu, while Rosa remained invisible in the background, ensuring that water glasses stayed filled and plates were cleared with silent efficiency. But that night, tragedy struck, or so it seemed. A silver serving tray containing a priceless, rare bottle of wine disappeared during the chaos of service. The wine was a 1947 Cheval Blanc, valued at over $15,000, part of Charles's investment-grade collection that he displayed like artwork. When the bottle went missing during the dinner service, panic rippled through the serving staff. Marco's crew immediately pointed fingers elsewhere, protecting their own reputations, while suspicion began to settle on the household staff who had been relegated to supporting roles in their own workspace. Suspicion fell unfairly on Rosa, the outsider whose presence had been merely tolerated throughout the evening's production. Charles, inflamed by the humiliation of losing such an expensive piece in front of his influential guests, and perhaps influenced by one too many glasses of champagne, made a decision that would haunt both of them. In a rare moment of cold cruelty, Fueled by embarrassment and the need to maintain face in front of his wealthy associates, he cornered Rosa in the kitchen and began hissing accusations, his voice carrying enough volume to attract the attention of nearby staff and lingering guests. "Theft is theft, regardless of whatever sob story you might have," Charles declared, his words cutting through Rosa like winter wind off Lake Michigan. His face was flushed with anger and alcohol, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something ugly and desperate. The man who had never bothered to learn her full name was now publicly destroying her reputation based on nothing more than the convenience of having someone to blame. Rosa stood quietly, her hands still damp from washing dishes, her uniform spotless despite 12 hours of service, her dignity intact even as accusations rained down upon her like hail. Without a chance to explain, without any investigation beyond his own need to assign blame, Charles fired her on the spot. He shouted about trust and betrayal while Rosa remained silent, understanding that no words would penetrate his wall of embarrassment and privilege. The guests who had consumed her secretly improved dishes now watched with the morbid curiosity of spectators at an accident, their charitable concerns for hungry children forgotten in the face of this real-time drama. Charles shoved her toward the service exit, his actions witnessed by staff members who had worked alongside Rosa for years, their shocked faces reflecting the injustice they were powerless to prevent. She wiped tears from her face as she gathered her apron and her shattered dignity, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of unfair judgment. Rosa left silently, carrying the heartbreak of being convicted, not by evidence but by assumption, not by facts, but by the convenience of her expendability. The elevator descended 30 floors, each floor marking another level of her descent from the warm kitchen she had made home to the cold streets of a city that felt suddenly hostile and unwelcoming. The mansion, once a place where Rosa's love had created warmth from sterility, fell into muted despair almost immediately. Without her quiet presence anchoring the household's emotional ecosystem, the family began to drift like ships without compass. The celebrity chef's flashy cooking had dazzled eyes but starved spirits, leaving everyone technically fed but emotionally malnourished. Xavier's molecular gastronomy experiments continued, but without Rosa's subtle interventions, the food became increasingly clinical and unsatisfying. Madison and Tyler, who had never acknowledged Rosa's contributions, found themselves inexplicably irritable and dissatisfied with their meals. The breakfast burritos were replaced with expensive organic granola that tasted like cardboard, the homemade pozole substituted with delivery from trendy restaurants that charged $20 for portions that left them hungry an hour later. Emma, the youngest, felt Rosa's absence most acutely, wandering into the kitchen hopefully each morning, only to find it empty of the warmth and laughter that had made it magical. Charles dined alone many nights, the sleek meals failing to fill the aching emptiness inside him, despite their perfect presentation and premium ingredients. The long dining table, which had once echoed with the sounds of family meals that Rosa had made possible, now stretched like a desert between him and his children. Conversations became stilted, the natural flow of family life disrupted by the absence of the woman who had been its uncredited orchestrator. Even his business dinners lost their warmth, guests commenting that something felt different about the house, though they couldn't identify what had changed. The kitchen itself seemed to rebel against its new occupants. Equipment that had hummed reliably under Rosa's care began to malfunction. The expensive espresso machine produced bitter coffee, the convection oven heated unevenly, and the refrigerator developed mysterious temperature fluctuations that spoiled ingredients. It was as if the space mourned the loss of the one person who had truly understood its purpose, who had transformed it from a showroom of expensive appliances into a genuine heart of the home. Months passed like seasons changed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside the penthouse, time felt frozen in a permanent winter. Rosa's small apartment in Pilsen became her refuge, though the transition from abundance to austerity was jarring and painful. Her savings, never substantial on a domestic worker's salary, dwindled quickly as she searched for new employment in a job market that seemed indifferent to her decades of experience. The restaurant industry, she discovered, valued formal credentials over intuitive skills, certificates over the wisdom that came from years of feeding families with love. She struggled with pride and poverty in equal measure, too dignified to seek help from the few friends who knew her situation, too heartbroken to immediately trust another wealthy employer. Rosa began offering meals to neighbors in her building, elderly residents who remembered what real food tasted like, and young families who appreciated her affordable prices and generous portions. From her tiny kitchen, she recreated the same magic she had brought to Charles's penthouse, but now for people who understood the value of her gifts, even if they couldn't afford to pay what her skills were truly worth. In her darkest moments, usually in the early morning hours when sleep eluded her, Rosa battled the demons of self-doubt that Charles's accusations had planted in her heart. She replayed that terrible evening over and over, wondering if she could have done something differently, if there were signs she had missed, if her invisibility in that household had somehow made her complicit in her own destruction. The weight of false accusation is heavier than actual guilt, because it carries the burden of injustice alongside the pain of loss. Yet, even in these moments of despair, Rosa's heart remained unbroken. She would rise before dawn, as she always had, and begin preparing food for whoever might need it that day. Her hands still moved with the same grace, her seasoning still carried the same love, her understanding of hunger, both physical and emotional, remained as sharp as the knife she used to dice vegetables. The wealthy penthouse had rejected her, but the community around her small apartment embraced her gifts with gratitude that Charles's family had never shown. Then came the twist that changed everything, arriving like spring after the longest winter. A careless staff member named Jennifer, guilt finally overcoming fear of unemployment, confessed to Charles that she had taken the wine as a gift for her boyfriend's birthday. The young woman had been struggling financially, supporting her sick mother's medical bills on a server's wage, and the expensive bottle had seemed like an opportunity rather than a theft. Her confession was stammered and tearful, delivered during a quiet moment when Charles was reviewing household bills and wondering why his home felt so empty despite being filled with expensive things. The lie that had destroyed Rosa unraveled with the simple honesty of a desperate young woman who could no longer live with her cowardice. Jennifer explained that she had hidden the wine in her bag during the chaos of the charity gala, planning to return it, but panicking when the search began. She had watched Rosa be blamed and fired, her conscience eating at her for months until she could no longer sleep or look at herself in mirrors. The truth, when it finally emerged, carried the weight of all the assumptions and prejudices that had made Rosa an easy target for blame. Charles, tormented by guilt and the memory of Rosa's dignified silence in the face of his accusations, realized the magnitude of his injustice. The successful businessman who could analyze market trends and investment opportunities with surgical precision had failed to see the truth standing directly in front of him. Rosa had nourished his family, not just with flavor, but with soul, for 6 years, her presence as essential to their well-being as the expensive foundation that held up their penthouse home. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him gasping and shaken in his home office as Jennifer's words echoed around him. He understood that he had destroyed not just Rosa's livelihood, but her reputation, her sense of safety, her trust in the fairness of the world. The wine could be replaced, but the damage he had inflicted on an innocent woman who had given him years of devoted service was irreversible. He had failed not just as an employer, but as a human being, allowing his privilege and pride to blind him to basic decency and justice. For weeks, Charles wrestled with his conscience and his pride in equal measure. His comfortable world suddenly felt hollow, filled with expensive objects, but empty of the warmth that Rosa had quietly created. He found himself unable to enjoy meals, unable to appreciate the luxury that surrounded him, unable to sleep peacefully knowing that somewhere in the city, a good woman was struggling because of his cruelty and prejudice. The weight of his guilt grew heavier with each passing day, until it became unbearable. One evening, unable to face himself any longer in the reflection of his floor-to-ceiling windows, Charles drove his expensive car through the familiar streets of Pilsen, searching for the woman he had wronged so deeply. The neighborhood felt foreign to him, despite being only miles from his penthouse. Small houses with American and Mexican flags hanging side by side, corner stores with hand-painted signs, families gathering on stoops to share evening conversations. It was a world where people still knew their neighbors' names, where community mattered more than net worth, where Rosa had found refuge among people who valued her gifts. He found her small apartment building through the investigation services that money could buy. But when he stood outside her door, his wealth felt meaningless and his apologies inadequate. Charles knocked, his hands shaking not from cold but from the weight of his own shame. When Rosa opened the door, her face showed surprise rather than anger, grace rather than resentment. She stood in the doorway of her modest home, wearing the same dignity she had maintained even in her moment of greatest humiliation, and Charles understood that he was in the presence of someone far richer in spirit than he could ever hope to be. Their reunion was a silent dance of forgiveness, more powerful than any words could have been. Rosa invited him into her tiny kitchen, a space no larger than his walk-in closet but infinitely warmer than any room in his penthouse. The familiar smells of cumin and cilantro, corn masa and slow-simmered beans filled the air like an embrace he didn't deserve but desperately needed. Without speaking, Rosa began preparing food, her hands moving with the same gentle precision he remembered but had never truly appreciated. She offered him a bowl of steaming tortilla soup, fragrant with the same love-laden spices that had once filled his grand dining room but had never touched his heart. The ceramic bowl was chipped, the spoon was mismatched, the table surface was scarred from years of use, yet Charles tasted something in that simple meal that had been missing from every expensive dish he'd consumed since Rosa left. Authentic nourishment, food prepared not as performance, but as gift, sustenance that fed the soul alongside the body. They shared a quiet moment where words fell away and understanding poured in like light through her small kitchen window. Charles lowered his gaze, not out of shame alone, but from awe at the depth of character he had ignored. The treasure he had discarded, the grace he had never deserved, but was now receiving without conditions or demands. Rosa's forgiveness was not given because he had earned it, but because her heart was incapable of holding on to the poison of resentment. She had learned long ago that hatred hurt the hater more than the hated, that grace was a choice that liberated the giver rather than the receiver. In the months that followed, Charles made the only meaningful gesture he could, using his wealth not to assuage his own guilt, but to honor Rosa's dreams and talents. He helped her open a small eatery on a bustling Pilsen corner, a place where every dish told a story of resilience and love. The restaurant space was modest, nothing like the gleaming kitchen she had worked in for years, but it belonged entirely to her. The name painted on the window read, Abuela's Kitchen, honoring the grandmother whose hands had first taught Rosa that food was love made visible. The restaurant blossomed quickly, becoming a beacon for those who hungered for genuine comfort and connection. Rosa's menu featured no molecular gastronomy or Instagram-worthy plating, just honest food prepared with skill and love. Her pozole drew lines around the block on cold Chicago nights, her tamales sold out every weekend before noon, and her simple rice and beans tasted like a mother's embrace to anyone lucky enough to find a seat at her small tables. The reviews in local papers praised not just the food, but the feeling of coming home that permeated every aspect of the dining experience. Charles himself often came, not as a patron flaunting privilege, but as a man seeking to learn the language of food's true power. He would sit at corner tables, watching Rosa move through her tiny dining room with the same grace she had brought to his penthouse kitchen, but now her gifts were seen and appreciated by every person she served. The once lonely millionaire found himself among laughter, aromas, and the warmth he never knew he was missing. Emma, his youngest daughter, became Rosa's most regular visitor, learning recipes and life lessons in equal measure from the woman who had always seen her worth. Through tears and toil, Rosa's quiet strength became legendary in the neighborhood. She embodied humility, resilience, and love, traits that healed not just a broken kitchen, but fractured hearts throughout the community. Her story spread beyond Pilsen through word of mouth and social media posts from customers who understood they had discovered something rare and precious. Food bloggers and restaurant critics began making pilgrimages to taste Rosa's cooking, but she remained unchanged by attention, focused on the simple mission of feeding people well and treating every customer like family. Charles's relationship with his own family began to heal as well, as he learned from Rosa's example that love was expressed through service rather than acquisition. The connection came from presence rather than presence. He started cooking simple meals with Emma, their clumsy attempts at Rosa's recipes filled with more laughter than the expensive catered dinners they had consumed for years. Madison and Tyler, initially skeptical of their father's transformation, began to join these family cooking sessions, discovering that their father had depths beyond his bank accounts and investment portfolios. Rosa's small restaurant became a gathering place for the community, hosting birthday parties and anniversary celebrations, providing free meals during local festivals, and serving as an unofficial community center where neighbors could come together over shared meals. Her success was measured not in profit margins, but in the faces of satisfied customers, not in reviews, but in the repeated visits from families who had made her restaurant part of their weekly traditions. She had created exactly what had been missing from Charles's penthouse, a place where food created connection rather than performance, where everyone who entered was seen and valued. And in rediscovering her, Charles rediscovered the meaning of home. His penthouse remained filled with expensive objects, but now he understood the difference between a house and a sanctuary, between consumption and nourishment, between having everything and feeling empty versus having less and feeling fulfilled. Rosa had taught him that wealth without warmth was poverty of the spirit, that true richness came from the relationships we nurture and the love we share, that the most important meals are those eaten with people who see our hearts rather than our bank accounts. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Charles found himself questioning everything he had once valued, reevaluating the priorities that had guided his life for decades. His business meetings, once focused solely on profit margins and market dominance, began to include considerations of employee welfare and community impact. He started visiting the restaurant not just as a guilty benefactor, but as a man desperate to understand what Rosa possessed that he had spent his entire life seeking without knowing its name. In Rosa's presence, Charles began to remember fragments of his own childhood, moments buried beneath years of ambition and acquisition. He recalled his own grandmother's kitchen, far smaller and simpler than Rosa's, where the smell of baking bread had once filled Sunday mornings with promise. Those memories had been pushed aside in his relentless climb toward success, dismissed as sentimentality that had no place in the corporate world he inhabited. But watching Rosa work, seeing the reverence she brought to the simplest tasks, he began to understand what he had lost in his pursuit of what he thought he wanted. Emma's relationship with Rosa deepened into something resembling the bond between grandmother and grandchild, a connection that Charles's own children had been denied by his relentless work schedule and emotional distance. Every afternoon after school, Emma would appear at the restaurant, her backpack heavy with homework she would ignore in favor of learning to make fresh salsa or roll perfect tortillas. Rosa would greet her with the same warm smile she offered every customer, but Emma received something extra: patient instruction, gentle correction, and the kind of undivided attention that money couldn't purchase. The little girl began to bridge the gap between Rose's world and her father's, carrying stories home that slowly chipped away at Charles's hardened perspectives. She would describe Rose's customers, the elderly man who came for soup every Tuesday, because it reminded him of his late wife's cooking, the young mother who brought her crying baby, because Rosa somehow knew exactly how to soothe fussing children, the teenager who did homework at a corner table, because Rosa's restaurant felt safer than the chaos of his own home. These stories painted a picture of community that Charles was only beginning to comprehend. Madison and Tyler, initially resistant to their father's transformation and skeptical of Rosa's forgiveness, gradually found themselves drawn into the orbit of warmth that surrounded Abuela's kitchen. Madison, who had dismissed Rosa's cooking as too ethnic during her teenage years of cultural rejection, discovered that she had inherited her grandmother's appreciation for authentic flavors. She began asking Rosa for recipes, not for school projects or social media posts, but because she genuinely wanted to recreate the comfort she had unknowingly rejected during her childhood. Tyler, the brother who had lived on energy drinks and processed foods, found himself craving the substantial nourishment that Rosa's meals provided. His adolescent metabolism, pushed beyond its limits by artificial stimulants and empty calories, responded hungrily to food prepared with intention and care. He began stopping by the restaurant after basketball practice, initially claiming he was just picking up Emma, but eventually admitting that Rosa's post-workout meals helped him feel stronger and more focused than any supplement he had ever tried. Rosa watched these transformations with the patient satisfaction of a gardener tending seedlings, knowing that growth required time and gentle nurturing. She never pushed for apologies or acknowledgments from the children who had once dismissed her. Instead, she simply continued offering the same generous love she had always provided, trusting that hearts would open when they were ready to receive what she had been trying to give all along. The restaurant itself evolved into something larger than Rosa had originally envisioned. What began as a simple eatery serving traditional Mexican cuisine became a cultural bridge connecting the established Pilsen community with newcomers seeking authentic connection. Young professionals working in the Loop would take the L train specifically to taste Rosa's cooking, many of them discovering for the first time that food could be something more than fuel or entertainment. They would sit beside construction workers and retired teachers, all united in their appreciation for meals prepared with genuine care. Rosa's hiring practices reflected her values. She employed women from the neighborhood, many of them immigrants like herself, who possessed cooking skills but lacked formal credentials. Under Rosa's guidance, these women learned not just restaurant service, but small business management, customer relations, and the confidence that came from having their cultural knowledge valued and respected. The restaurant became an unofficial training ground for entrepreneurship, with several of Rosa's employees eventually opening their own food businesses throughout the city. The success attracted the attention of food industry publications and television producers, but Rosa approached fame with the same humility she had maintained during years of invisibility. When reporters asked about her meteoric rise, she would redirect their attention to her employees, her customers, and the community that had supported her dreams. She understood that her story was not about individual triumph, but about the power of recognition, the importance of seeing people whose contributions had been overlooked, the healing that could occur when dignity was restored. Charles often sat in the restaurant's corner booth during these interviews, listening to Rosa deflect praise while crediting others for her success. He saw in her responses the leadership qualities he had spent decades trying to cultivate in corporate boardrooms, the ability to elevate others, to build loyalty through service rather than authority, to create value that extended far beyond financial metrics. It occurred to him that Rosa had always possessed the qualities he most admired in successful executives, but he had been too blinded by prejudice and privilege to recognize her talents. The neighborhood around Rosa's restaurant began to change as well, but not in the way that typically accompanied gentrification. Rather than displacing longtime residents, the increased attention brought resources and opportunities that benefited the existing community. Property values rose modestly, providing long-time homeowners with increased equity while remaining affordable for working families. New businesses opened, but they were often started by local entrepreneurs who understood the character of the neighborhood and contributed to its cultural richness rather than replacing it. Rosa found herself becoming an informal community leader, consulted on issues ranging from local business development to youth programs. Her restaurant hosted community meetings, fundraisers for families facing medical emergencies, and celebration dinners for neighborhood achievements. The space that had begun as Rosa's personal sanctuary expanded to become a gathering place that strengthened the social fabric of the entire area. Charles began to understand that Rosa's influence extended far beyond the meals she prepared. She had created something he had never managed to achieve despite decades of wealth and success, a legacy of positive impact that would outlive her physical presence. The relationships she had built, the community she had strengthened, the young people she had mentored would continue creating ripples of goodness long after her restaurant eventually closed. This realization both humbled and inspired him, showing him a model of success that had nothing to do with market dominance or profit margins. The lessons Rosa taught extended to Charles's business practices as well. He began treating his own employees with greater respect, taking time to learn their names and understand their challenges. He implemented family-friendly policies in his companies, created advancement opportunities for workers who lacked formal credentials but possessed practical skills, and started measuring success not just in quarterly profits, but in employee satisfaction and community impact. His business associates initially questioned these changes, but Charles found that treating people with dignity actually improved productivity and reduced turnover, creating value that traditional metrics had never captured. Emma's relationship with Rosa became a source of healing for Charles's understanding of fatherhood as well. Watching Rosa's patient instruction, her genuine interest in Emma's thoughts and feelings, her ability to make the child feel valued and heard, Charles began to recognize how much of his own daughter's childhood he had missed. He started requesting more detailed stories about Emma's days, asking about her friends and fears and dreams, rather than simply checking whether homework was completed and grades were acceptable. The change in Charles's parenting style created ripple effects throughout his family. Madison and Tyler, accustomed to interactions focused primarily on academic and behavioral expectations, began to open up about their own emotional needs and interests. Family dinners, once formal affairs centered around efficient consumption of catered meals, became opportunities for genuine conversation and connection. Charles discovered that his children were complex, thoughtful individuals with perspectives and talents he had never bothered to explore. Rosa observed these family transformations with quiet satisfaction, understanding that her influence had extended beyond the individual relationships to heal the disconnections that had plagued the Kensington household for years. She had not set out to become a family therapist or life coach, but her example of treating people with genuine care and attention had modeling effects that spread throughout Charles's personal and professional relationships. The restaurant's success also brought Rosa unexpected opportunities for recognition and expansion. Food Network producers approached her about television shows, publishers offered cookbook deals, and investors suggested franchise opportunities that could have made her wealthy by conventional standards. But Rosa turned down most of these offers, understanding that her true purpose was not fame or fortune, but the daily practice of feeding people with love and creating connections across cultural and economic divides. She accepted only the opportunities that aligned with her values, a cookbook that would preserve her grandmother's recipes and share the stories behind them, a scholarship program that would help young people from underserved communities attend culinary school, and occasional speaking engagements at events focused on immigration, entrepreneurship, and community development. Rosa understood that her platform came with responsibility, and she used her visibility to advocate for others who remained invisible in society's margins. Charles found himself learning about issues he had never considered during his years of wealth and privilege. Through Rosa's stories and his visits to her restaurant, he encountered the realities of immigration struggles, wage inequality, lack of health care access, and housing instability that affected many of her employees and customers. These were not abstract policy issues, but personal challenges faced by people he now considered friends, people whose stories had faces and names and hopes for better futures. This newfound awareness led Charles to examine his own role in perpetuating systems that created such inequalities. His real estate investments, stock portfolio, and business practices had all contributed to economic structures that prioritized profit over people, efficiency over empathy. He began divesting from companies that exploited workers, redirecting his investments toward businesses that demonstrated genuine concern for employee welfare and community impact. The transformation was not without its challenges. Charles's business associates questioned his new priorities. Some clients defected to competitors who offered purely profit-focused services, and his net worth actually decreased as he chose values-based investments over maximum returns. But he discovered that the financial losses were offset by gains in life satisfaction that he had never experienced during his years of single-minded wealth accumulation. Rosa watched Charles navigate these changes with the same patient support she offered everyone who entered her sphere of influence. She never lectured him about his past mistakes or pushed him toward specific decisions about his future. Instead, she simply continued modeling the values she believed in, trusting that authentic change would emerge from his own growing understanding rather than external pressure. The relationship between Rosa and Charles evolved into something resembling true friendship, built on mutual respect rather than economic disparity. Charles no longer saw Rosa as an employee to be managed or a charity case to be helped, but as a teacher whose wisdom had transformed his understanding of success and happiness. Rosa no longer saw Charles as an employer to be served or an adversary to be feared, but as a fellow human being struggling to find meaning and connection in a complex world. Their friendship became a bridge between two communities that had previously existed in isolation from each other. Charles's presence at Rosa's restaurant introduced wealthy professionals to authentic Mexican culture and community-centered values. Rosa's occasional visits to Charles's penthouse brought warmth and groundedness to a space that had previously felt cold and pretentious. These cross-cultural exchanges enriched both communities, breaking down stereotypes and building understanding across economic and ethnic divides. The story of Rosa and Charles began to be shared beyond their immediate circle, becoming a symbol of redemption and transformation that resonated with people facing their own struggles with privilege, prejudice, and the search for authentic meaning. Journalists wrote articles about their unlikely friendship. Sociologists studied their relationship as an example of cross-cultural healing. And community organizers pointed to Rosa's restaurant as a model for inclusive economic development. But for Rosa and Charles themselves, the public attention was secondary to the personal healing they had experienced. Rosa had regained not just her livelihood, but her faith in human capacity for growth and change. Charles had discovered not just Rosa's forgiveness, but his own ability to become the kind of person he had always wanted to be. Both had learned that transformation was possible at any age, that mistakes could become catalysts for wisdom, that love expressed through service could heal wounds that seemed permanent. As seasons continued to change outside the windows of both Rosa's restaurant and Charles's penthouse, their stories became intertwined in ways that transcended their original employee-employer relationship. They had become family in the deepest sense, not through blood or marriage, but through the choice to see each other's full humanity and to support each other's continued growth. Emma, now several years older and wiser from her time with Rosa, began to dream of a future where she might combine her father's business acumen with Rosa's community-centered values. She talked about opening restaurants that would serve authentic food while providing job training and advancement opportunities for immigrants and other underserved populations. Her dreams represented a synthesis of the lessons she had learned from both Rosa and Charles, a vision of success that measured profit alongside human impact. Rosa listened to Emma's dreams with the same patient attention she had always offered, understanding that this young woman represented the possibility of a different kind of leadership, one that combined privilege with responsibility, ambition with compassion, business success with community service. In Emma, Rosa saw the fulfillment of her own deepest hopes for the next generation. Charles watched his daughter's transformation with wonder and pride, recognizing that she had learned lessons he was still struggling to master. Emma's easy comfort with people from all backgrounds, her natural inclination toward service, her ability to see potential in overlooked individuals, these qualities had been shaped by her time with Rosa in ways that no amount of expensive education could have provided. The restaurant continued to thrive, but Rosa began to think about legacy in broader terms than business success. She wanted to ensure that the values and practices she had developed would continue after her own involvement ended. She began mentoring younger women who shared her passion for community-centered cooking, teaching them not just recipes and techniques, but the philosophy of service that had guided her own career. Charles, meanwhile, found himself thinking about his own legacy in completely different terms than he had for most of his adult life. Rather than focusing on the financial empire he would leave behind, he began considering the relationships he had built, the people he had helped, the positive changes he had catalyzed through his transformed approach to business and family. He realized that Rosa's influence had given him the opportunity to become worthy of the love his children offered, worthy of the respect his employees showed, worthy of the trust his community placed in him. The story that had begun with injustice and misunderstanding had become something larger, a testament to the possibility of redemption, the power of forgiveness, the transformative potential of seeing and valuing every person's contributions. Rosa's quiet dignity in the face of false accusation had modeled grace under pressure. Charles's journey from prejudice to understanding had demonstrated that change was possible even for those who seemed set in their ways. Together, they had created something beautiful from the ashes of a terrible mistake. Their relationship had become a living example of the principles Rosa had always believed in, that every person deserved to be seen and valued, that food prepared with love could heal wounds that seemed permanent, that true wealth came not from accumulation, but from connection, that home was not a place, but a feeling, created when people chose to care for each other with intention and grace. As Rosa looked around her bustling restaurant on any given evening, watching families share meals, friends celebrate milestones, and neighbors gather in community, she understood that she had achieved something more valuable than personal success. She had created a space where love was made visible through service, where dignity was extended to everyone who entered, where the best of human nature could flourish despite the challenges of an often harsh world. Charles, sitting at his usual corner table, watching Rosa move through her domain with the same grace she had brought to his penthouse kitchen years before, understood that he had been given an extraordinary gift, the chance to learn that true success was measured not in dollars accumulated, but in lives touched, not in market dominance achieved, but in dignity restored, not in power wielded, but in service rendered. And so their story continued, not as a tale with a neat conclusion, but as an ongoing testament to the power of recognition, forgiveness, and the choice to see the full humanity in every person who crosses our path. In a world that often seems divided by wealth and circumstance, culture and background, their friendship stood as a beacon of hope, proof that understanding could bridge any gap, that love could heal any wound, that it was never too late to right a wrong or become the person we were meant to be. So, I want to ask you, have you ever cooked for someone who never said thank you? Have you poured yourself into invisible work that felt like a thankless gift? Have you ever been the one whose efforts held a family together, whose love created the foundation for others' success, whose presence made a house feel like home, only to be overlooked or dismissed when it was convenient? Tell me in the comments below, because your story matters and your contributions deserve recognition. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another woman who cooks with her soul, who serves with her heart, who deserves to know that her gifts are seen and valued. For more heartfelt stories that honor the unsung heroes in our communities, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. We'll see you in the next story, where we continue celebrating the quiet heroines who make our world warmer, one meal at a time.